Hi, bro.
Hello, and welcome to the Oxford Forum for Questioning Extremism's second event of Trinity Term, a panel discussion on the topic of power and political opposition in Putin's Russia. Today, we'll be attempting to deconstruct the political world of present-day Russia, first addressing the question of how Putin and his regime operates, and then moving on to discuss the issue of opposition, considering what threats there may be to his rule, especially in the context of recent events surrounding the arrest and imprisonment of opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Discussion will last around 45 to 50 minutes, leaving around 10 minutes for questions from the audience at the end. And audience members, when we get to this section, use the raise hand feature. I'll be able to unmute you and you can pose your question directly to the panelists. We're very lucky to have a brilliant panel of experts with us today. Bill Browder is a financier and political activist who is the founder and CEO of Hermitage Capital Management, one of the largest funds investing in post-Soviet Russia. After his colleague Sergei Medvedev died in a Moscow prison in 2009, Bill has led a renowned international campaign exposing corruption and human rights abuses in Russia. Sergei Medvedev is a political scientist and journalist who, until recently, was professor of social sciences at the High School of Economics in Moscow. He's also the author of an award-winning book on societal and political developments in Russia in the last decade. Dr. Gulnaz Sharafutdinova is a political scientist at the King's College London Russia Institute, where she specialises in comparative politics and political economy with a focus on contemporary Russia. And she's recently published a book entitled The Red Mirror, Putin's Leadership and Russia's Insecure Identity. And finally, Dr. Samuel Greene is director of the Russia Institute and professor in Russian politics at King's College London and an associate fellow of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. So thank you all very much to all panelists for coming on today. And I'd like to start by asking each of you to outline briefly how either your research or your experience working in or with Russia intersects with the topic in question. And perhaps give us some general introductory thoughts about the current state of Putin's authority in Russia. So Sergei, could we start with you, please?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Happy to see many old acquaintances and friends. Putin's authority is quite cemented, I would say, by now. So the authority has used to its advantage 2020, the pandemic year, and 2021, which is also the pandemic year. So what was seen initially as a kind of a shock for the authority was the drastic fall in the oil price, with the wreck of the Saudi Arabia deal, and with pandemic coming to Russia, kind of a black swan, which has derailed Putin's plans for 2020. Like the celebration, the Victory Day celebrations, changing the constitution and so on. But I think the Russian authorities have quickly reorganized themselves and used the situation to their advantage. Virtually, I would say, we can say quite confidently by May 2021, destroying the opposition, the so-called non-systemic opposition. Finally undoing the entire web of Alexei Navalny, and actually they're now working with it as they would as a doctor, as a surgeon would be working with a cancer, like cleansing the metastasis of FBK, of Navalny's foundation all across the political spectrum and civil society. So for all intents and purposes, this movement is now non-functional. And then also they've used this for silencing any meaningful political protest. So now, like, gathering in any number, more than 3, more than 2, is violating the sanitary prescriptions in Russia. Although, of course, the pro-government rallies can be organized in any numbers and in any circumstances. For instance, a pro-Putin rally at the Luzhniki Stadium celebrating the, what is it now, 7 years of the annexation of Crimea. So the stadium, the entire stadium was packed, but exactly around the same dates, they are arresting the leaders of the opposition for violating the sanitary precautions for organizing the opposition meetings. So yeah, they're very smartly using the biopolitics in order to destroy the opposition and any kind of an alternative activity in Russia. And now, after the constitutional change in the summer of 2020, the authority, the regime looks pretty much consolidated and poised to rule until what seems now to be Putin's life term. At least the road of is paved until 2036 and maybe beyond that. Constitution has been turned into sort of a meaningless sheet of paper in many respects. The repressive organs have been reinforced, and actually Russia has learned also the lessons from Belarus, and actually following in the footsteps of Belarus. For many years, my Minsk friends have been telling me that Russia is following the repressive scenario, following Minsk in its repressive scenario with a lag of some 3, 4, 5 years. And I wasn't believing them. So I was saying, like, come on. Like you have a sort of a North Korea of sorts with death penalty, with empty streets, packed with policemen, and silenced urban class, and like assassinations of opposition leaders. But now, in the span of the past year and a half, I have seen this all arrive into my own country. So this gap between Moscow and Minsk has shortened dramatically. So Moscow is literally following in Minsk footsteps, and the lessons of destroying the Belarusian opposition has also been learned quite well. In Moscow, they see that oppression works, that fear works, and unfortunately, this is a situation as it is now. I would also say that, the lessons of Venezuela have been also learned in Moscow, and Russia is quite a smart and quick learner in terms of the worst practices across the globe. Not Russia, but the Kremlin in this sense. So yes, I'm afraid to say that the picture is quite bleak, as seen from Moscow, from somewhat, critically minded in living in Russia these days. It is, of course, complicated by the fact that the people are locked inside the country. Okay, you can theoretically travel to places like Tanzania, the Seychelles Islands, maybe Cyprus or Turkey for vacation. But otherwise, in order to move outside of Russia, you need a special reason. It's like, for me, I need to go to some EU countries. I cannot at this time. I don't have a special reason. Although I have a Schengen visa, I cannot go to any of the EU country at this point. So this has been augmented by, the new quasi-Soviet sense of immobilization and being locked inside your own country. Which also adds to the confusion of these days. So yeah, no good messages from me at this point. Well, in a way, of course, this is not Turkmenistan yet. This is not North Korea yet. This is not even Minsk yet. But I think basically the trend is obviously there. And I don't think the trend will go as far as turning Moscow into Ashgabat and or Pyongyang. No, they don't even need it because it's like how it's called, asymptotic approximation, like in mathematics, to this to this imaginary 1937. It's brinkmanship. It's balancing on the verge of war with Ukraine, but never unleashing this war. It's balancing on the verge of mass repression, but never really unleashing mass repression, because this is enough to instill fear in the Russian population and enough to instill fear in the Western public, that this is now a regime which is capable of everything. And so they have proven this. There's a credible threat. Like look at Alexei Navalny's case, and that's it. So yeah.
And Gulnaz, do you think just on your introductory thoughts, do you agree on everything Sergei said there about the sort of fully repressive capabilities of the state at this point in time?
Yes, Aaron, thank you. Yes, in terms of, Sergei mentioned cemented power, and I wanted to talk a little bit about how that cementation sedimentation and cementation has occurred, and bring to your attention the book that I published recently that looked at Putinism and Putin's sources of power from the perspective of the period of time when Putin was most popular. And I was trying to understand what that popularity is founded upon. And my answers I found in social identity theory and in the Kremlin strategy of identity politics and national identity politics, and Kremlin strategy of building social consensus around certain shared ideas, and specifically the shared ideas about the 1990s, sort of that were presented as collective trauma and that were the foundation of that social consensus, plus the glory of the World War II, certain glories associated with the Soviet past, and the media strategies of besieged fortress that have been really influential and important and are still ongoing strategy from, especially from the state-controlled TV programming. Just to check out before such presentations, I usually go and check out what Solovyov is telling us in the evening with Vladimir Solovyov, one of the most widely recognized and actually respected journalists that we as political scientists do watch him, but a few people like him a lot, Anyway, so I was just checking the presentation of Solovyov for May 12th, which started with Solovyov's very sad sort of description of the events in Kazan. There was a school shooting, a rather unusual happening in Russia. And very quickly after presenting that school shooting and the fact that the authorities failed to catch this young boy of 19-year-old who went on the streets with his rifle, Solovyov quickly turned away from that massacre in which 9 people died, to how all the bad things are coming from the West, and switching totally the frame to discussing, both the shootings in the United States, but also why the United Kingdom or the United States and its authorities and its societies are a bad influence on Russia. So this besieged fortress idea is still very much a strong part of the strategy, of the media strategy from the Kremlin. Now, we do know that many people watch TV, but that number is slowly going down, and the younger population in Russia, younger people are not watching really TV, are not really glued to watching Solovyov at all. So from that perspective, the Kremlin's media strategy is becoming less influential than it used to be, probably at its heights. But it's still there. And so from that perspective, although we do see that after the height of post-Crimea euphoria, Putin's popularity has fallen, especially after 2018, the media strategy and the consolidation strategy and the key messages that are sent to the society are still remaining the same. But we do have, I think in response to very bold and heroic actions from Navalny, the Kremlin had stepped up its repression apparatus, and as Sergei rightly presented, sort of just in a surgical action, trying to do away with whatever organized and mobilized parts of the society that were anti-Kremlin. Now, the one question that I might just pose maybe later on, and I'm not here to put questions, but still something that I found quite interesting, and to Sam and Sergei and Bill, Leonid Volkov, I just watched his latest addressing of the followers in terms of we are disbanding all the Navalny shtabs, headquarters, but it doesn't mean we're giving up, that these headquarters will be working as autonomous organizations. And so he is sort of keeping an upbeat tone on that. I think it's worth discussing whether these ideas about people that they brought up through work and mobilization, whether that type of work could continue. Probably in some regions, yes, in some regions, no. But I was glad to see, and this is like the Navalny style, right? But in Volkov's words, this sense of optimism still remaining. And they are politicians, of course, they have to keep it that way. But it's interesting to think practically whether there is any space for continuation of the sort of work that they have been doing.
And just to sort of zoom in on one thing you mentioned there about memory of the 1990s in the Soviet Union. Bill, obviously you've got sort of pertinent personal experience of this time, or perhaps the 2000s as well. So sort of what could you tell us from that experience about this period in Russia, and about how important this idea, this image of Putin as the sort of restorer of order to the West, confronter of the oligarchs? What could you tell us about how important those things are?
So I lived in Russia from 1996 to 2005, running the Hermitage Fund, which was the largest foreign investment fund in the country. And so I was there from the moment from the Yeltsin. I was there during the Yeltsin era, and I was there during the moments when Putin replaced Yeltsin. And Putin's pitch to everybody. So Yeltsin was running a totally chaotic situation where he basically gave 40% of the country to 22 oligarchs in exchange for support and staying in power. And those 22 oligarchs took away everything, and the average Russian, and we have a few Russians on this call who probably remember those times very bleakly, where everybody had it might have been a free political time, but it wasn't a free time for anything else. And the life expectancy of a man was like 55 years. And professors had to become taxi drivers and nurses had to become prostitutes. And it was just the most horrible time. And so Putin came in with this pitch that I'm going to restore order. And that kind of looked good for everybody. And I'm going to take away the power of these oligarchs. And for a brief period of time, it kind of, when he wasn't sort of all powerful, he was kind of behaving like you might expect a technocratic new leader to be operating. I mean, you could kind of look at the list of stuff he was doing, and it was kind of good. But it was just sort of a holding pattern, and the holding pattern changed when he arrested Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos, the richest oligarch in the country, and he arrested him, put him in jail, put him on trial. And all the other oligarchs came and said to him, Vladimir, what do we have to do to make sure that we don't end up like Khodorkovsky? And Putin said 50%. And not for the Russian government or for the presidential administration of Russia, but Vladimir Putin wanted his cut. And so he wasn't really trying to displace the oligarchs. What he was trying to do is become the biggest oligarch himself. And so there was then this big shift where he became the biggest oligarch in Russia, and the rest, and the people sort of close around him became, sort of the junior oligarchs. And he just ran the same kind of regime where a few people got everything and everyone else got nothing. And life expectancy increased a bit, but not dramatically. And if you look at the charts over the last 6 or 7 years, the real income in Russia has dropped. And so whatever he was pitching to the Russian people back in year 2000 or year 2005, I mean, he's had 20 years, and so he can't blame it on anybody else now. I mean, there is no way to blame it on some other factors. I mean, the average Russian is worse off, and because of his policies. And so, so what do you do in a situation like that when you have a supposed democracy where you're supposed to be voting for the president of your country, and there's 142 million Russians, 141 million of them are really doing badly because of this guy? All you can do is make sure that there's nobody else around that can replace you. And we've seen that with the killing of Nemtsov, with the arrest of Navalny, with the exile of Kasparov, with Udaltsov. I mean, they're on and on and on. Everybody who had posed any possible risk to Putin has been sidelined. And then what does Putin do? Two things. He's got the more people become grumpy, and they're grumpy, there's no question about it. He turns the screws on the people internally, more authoritarianism, and then he creates more distractions internationally so that so the anger is directed elsewhere. And I was at a dinner last night and with a Canadian friend of mine, and he asked me about Navalny. He said, well, why did he go back to Russia? And my answer is that he went back to Russia because he thinks that, and I think he's right about this, that there's a reasonable chance, putting aside all of Putin's efforts and putting aside all of what the opposition is organizing, that if this whole thing inflames, and it has every possibility of inflaming based on the fact that everybody is doing so badly, he is the guy who could become the next president of Russia. And so whether he can organize an uprising, maybe not. But this is a very brittle situation. It's not, I would imagine that Putin, he's just playing from one day to the next, because he really doesn't know at what point people will say enough is enough. And maybe they won't say enough is enough ever. And he has some control over that by doing these repressions. But at the same time, he doesn't know if the repressions at one point, spark something much, much worse. And he was terrified of this Navalny situation with the demonstrations, just terrified. And you can see that in the actions of the police and the law enforcement and all the arrests and all this crazy stuff they're doing. But this situation is not within anyone's control, and it's not predictable. You can say that, yeah, he's going to stay in power till the end of his life. Yeah, well, that's his plan. Mubarak said that until he couldn't say that. And these situations are completely non-predictable. And I think that Navalny has a real chance if Russian people decide enough is enough, that he's the guy who would be leading leading Russia in a new situation.
Now, Sam, a lot of your research has sort of focused on the idea of shifting the focus from Putin back towards sort of Russian society and Russian citizens. So how do you think, or could you characterize the sort of common perception of Russian citizens towards Putin? Do you think it's sort of changed significantly in recent months or recent years, perhaps?
Good question. I don't really have a good answer to what's happened in recent months. It certainly has changed a bit in recent years, but not maybe as dramatically as Putin's view of the people has changed. And I think that's an important part of understanding this story, right? So Putin comes to power, as Bill was describing, in 1999, first as prime minister and then as president, right? And he inherits an economy that was in shambles, right? But that had hit rock bottom and had really been through the worst of what was inevitably going to be a very painful reform process. He got lucky in that oil prices started to come in and the economy started to turn around on some level. But he also got lucky because he inherited a society at that point that had learned to stop relying on the state, right? That everything that Russians had been through to the last 10 years of Soviet existence, and then the first 10 to 15 years by the time Putin got going of post-Soviet experience, taught you that the only way that you built any security and prosperity for yourself and your family was by relying on resources and relationships that were really at arm's length, right? You didn't rely on the state. You can read a lot about sort of paternalism and collectivism in Russia, and philosophically maybe it's there, but politically it's a myth, right? Russians don't actually, by and large, expect a lot from the state. And that was a great benefit to Putin, right? Because as he was doing all of the things that Bill was talking about in terms of concentrating economic power and re-centralizing economic power in the Kremlin, he didn't actually have to deliver much to ordinary Russians. He just had to get the state out of their way, right? So he lowered taxes, he kept borders open, he made it a little bit easier. Europe helped, right, for people to get visas. Trade was liberalized, right? So some things happened that made ordinary Russians' lives easier. And of course, the economy kept growing year after year, which made people's lives easier. So before they got worse off over the last several years, Russians got to a point where they were living better off than Russians ever had, right? In history, right? But interestingly, even though Putin kept getting votes, he didn't actually get the credit from that, right? If you talk to ordinary Russians, interview people, survey people, what you find is that people chalk their own success, right, down to their own efforts, right, to the things that they did in their lives to support themselves. Putin, for reasons that Gulnaz was describing, won legitimacy as a symbol, right? As a rallying point, and as a way of people to sort of communicate a sense of their identity as members of this Russian political community. But it wasn't really a material connection, right? That came back to bite him in 2011, 2012, when he essentially announced that he was going to again subvert the constitution for the first time, and allow himself another 2 terms in the presidency. And there was a portion of Russians, particularly living in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, but not exclusively, who had left to their own devices, begun to imagine a different future for themselves and for the country, right? Who traveled to Europe, who made use of all of this new prosperity, and were trying to transform their own lives and the lives of the communities they were living in new ways. And for them, the idea that things were going to continue to look like they had over the past 20 years was not an attractive option, and they voted accordingly. And then the state decided not to count their votes. And so they came out into the streets and protested, right? Which was the first time that there was any real ground level opposition to Putin. Not enough to create a regime change, right? Not enough to overturn the results of the elections, but enough really to spook Putin and his advisors and the Kremlin. And that led to, again, a lot of the things that Gulnaz was talking about, trotting out ideas about ideology, right? About Western versus traditional Russian values, about LGBT rights, right? About these nefarious Westerners coming to adopt Russian orphans and all of the ills that could come with that, together with secularism and all of these other things that they use to try to drive a wedge between these opposition-minded Russian citizens and the sort of the core of Putin's voters, and that worked for a time. Right. And then certainly things like the annexation of Crimea and the advent of real confrontation with the West helped a bit more, but really only for a time. Right. And what we've seen in the last 6 months or so, right, is that the Kremlin has really abandoned the idea of legitimation as a strategy for staying in power. Right. The Kremlin's ability to use Putin's legitimacy, such as it was, right, among the bulk of the Russian population, really lowered the transaction costs for ruling Russia as an autocrat. Right. It meant you didn't have to coerce people. Right. You didn't have to invest in a security state to that degree. Right. You also didn't have to pay people off. You didn't have to co-opt people as much. But something has happened, right, in the last 6 to 12 months or so, depending on where you want to sort of count the turning points. We can have that conversation, right? But something has happened that's made the Kremlin lose confidence in this strategy and decide that really the only way that they can deal with challenges is not to have any challenges at all, right? And so they have severely curtailed. There is essentially no room left for any kind of autonomous civic or political activity, very little room left for autonomous media activity. And I really like Sergei's metaphor of sort of this asymptotic, right, authoritarianism, right? It will continue to approach, right, this asymptote, right, this absolute level of autocracy without ever reaching it. But by the same token, it has to keep continuing, right? It has to keep moving, and so these screws will continue to get tightened. In terms of why they're doing that, I think that is an open question to which we don't really have an answer yet. I think part of it is a sense that there is a real challenge from below, and they don't really know how they're going to deal with it. So Navalny, even if he, in official polls or available polls at relatively low numbers, right, is a threat that they don't really quite know how to deal with. They don't have the ideological means to win people back on board, and they don't have the material relationships to begin building up a new base of support that would overcome that. But again, they've got this population, right, that does not see the state, whoever's running it, right, as a material source of support. Right? So if the symbolism, if this emotional and identity connection that Gulnaz was describing begins to fade, right, then it's not clear what else the Kremlin can rely on other than the use of force.
And just on that point about sort of the fading of this perhaps ideology that Gulnaz was talking about, how successful do you think Putin has been, Gulnaz, in this sort of in his attempts to forge this new sense of Russian national identity in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union? Do you think it's worked, and do you think it is fading at the moment, as Sam suggested it might be?
Yes, I think the most prominent years when this politics worked is between 2014 and 18. And the first hit, very visible hit on his popularity, was followed the pension reform, where many Russians felt really betrayed because there were earlier promises of not really touching the pension age, and then the retirement age was increased, and that was really going into the pockets of Russians. So although already, I think from 2017, the Levada polls showed rather gradual decrease in popularity levels. So that euphoric sort of mobilized sense of support for national identity has that prime time has passed. Now, I'd say that it's still, you know, that's why I'm watching this. You know, I do go and look back what Solovyov is doing, and whether they're still trying to rely on that. That now I do notice some gradients, some nuances in that besieged fortress. It's about really suggesting that, you know, that the anxieties that people are experiencing today, the frustrations that people are experiencing today, could be channeled to outside forces, to outside sources or internal enemies, right? So that channeling of the negative emotion to outside and trying to convey the image of the Kremlin and the Russian population and the Russian government. You know, there is a saying in Russia, "Белый пушистый," sort of, you know, from a much more positive perspective, is still there. And I think for a big chunk of the population, those sort of people who might not have traveled to all the countries, people who might be sort of more locked into their local identities, that enemy somewhere out there, that idea might still resonate, I believe. But from that positive force of support for Putin, that strategy doesn't work anymore. I would suggest, though, that what works additionally, and that's where another sort of ideas from social psychology help, is that many people experience a sense of resignation and apathy and just lack of political efficacy, that they can change anything. There is, and here I think actually Sam's much earlier concept of aggressive immobility, which is also quite psychological in its essence, is really, really helpful, that people who have achieved a certain sense of stability in their life and who have invested a lot of resources and time and money and connections to building that stability, they do not want change. They are afraid of change. And so we need to talk about quite a high degree of societal polarization, where there are people who want change and who don't see any future of Russia with what we have, with the status quo that we have now, and with quite a large chunk of the population, quite a big share of the population, that is simply afraid of change because they do not believe that change will bring anything good in their life. They have been conditioned by the unsuccessful reforms from the time of the Soviet collapse and from the late Soviet system as well, that any type of change that the government undertakes brings not just instability, not just discomfort, but it always brings loss to big shares of the population. So that social and psychological orientation to avoid change and to keep, however low we have fallen, but we can still fall still lower, that sense of resignation and that sense of sometimes aggressive opposition to change, I think works as another prop for the status quo that that Putin and the Kremlin could rely on today. So it's not that positive, Russia standing from its knees and sort of showing to the West that we're still strong and that we can do it, but it's this more apathetic orientation that no, any change is no good.
So on that point about sort of just general societal inertia, so in the context of in recent months, Russia seeing some of the biggest protests that's ever seen under Putin, first in January, in response to Navalny returning to Russia. Sergei, how far do you sort of agree with Gulnaz's point about this apathy in society? Do you think these protests are a genuine reflection of society-wide discontent, or is it still the sort of silent majority scenario where most people do, like Gulnaz says, prefer stability and fear change?
I would like first to comment on the previous question that is about the Russian national identity. I'm not sure that Putin has managed to create a sort of a national identity, at least not Russia in terms in the sense of an ethnic nation. I think what he has recreated is an imperial identity and a yearning for the glorious past. The kind of a retrotopia which Zygmunt Bauman was talking about. It's very nostalgic resentment. He sort of elevated and institutionalized this typical post-imperial ressentiment as the Weimar syndrome, you may compare this, which was very diffused in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And suddenly it was given a voice, it was given a shape. And suddenly the Russians were told by their own elite that they have lost, right? This wasn't a sense of this in the country in the 1990s, that Russia is a losing nation. Yes, there was hardship, but this was an idea of some kind of a civilizational perspective of moving forward, of a new beginning, and so on. But then comes Putin, and suddenly the country has been told that we have lost as a nation, that people have lost individually in the 1990s. That I remember this wonderful slogan by Zhirinovsky's party, "За русских, за бедных," for the Russians, for the poor. And I was taken aback by it. I think, in Jesus Christ, I mean, there are so many post-Soviet nations which do significantly worse than my nation. I mean, why are Russians designated as poor Russians? But I think they have brought this, typical sense, which is very well recorded in Russian literature, the sense of pity, the sense of self-pity, which we see in many Dostoevsky's characters, and Gogol's Small Man, and Vasily Rozanov was famously writing on Russians as like second Jews in terms of like promoting the idea of self-pity and building the whole national narrative on this. So we really saw this happening, and actually this brings me to your second question on the apathy and on the how you call it, выученная беспомощность, learned helplessness, right? With all these social experiments, when monkeys learn from previous generations that you learn fear, you learn helplessness, and so on. Yes, I see this apathy, I see this enemy, I see this social disjuncture. I see the inability, well, I wouldn't say total inability for collective action, because, some civil initiatives, they do spring up, especially in the times of the pandemic, and they were, wonderful examples of like mutual assistance, and people can organize like local events. They sometimes can stand up for some local cause, like protesting the building of a new church, and demanding the building of a new dumping site, away from the people, and so on. So yes, they occur occasionally, but in general, there's no platform, there are no institutions, there are no social lifts that could promote and channel this diffused sentiment into some kind of action. So there's, I think Levada has done really a lot of research on this. They really like this. There's much criticism of this, but there's also like at Levada, they like this whole Dubin's idea and the Levada's idea of the Soviet man, yeah, советский человек, as this, helpless man, totally dependent on the authorities, incapable of the a conscious, purposeful action, right? So the Soviet man has been recreated in the new social and political condition of the Putin era. Because what Putin has done, he really has recreated a kind of a Soviet society with the same dependence on the state, with the same, what Kardonsky calls сословное общество, the society of the states, with people depending on the distributive schemes of the state, distributing channels of the state budget, right? So this dependency has returned quite fast because there are really not so many people in Russia that live independent lives, that are responsible for their lives and their earnings. The same Kardonsky group counts them at about 20 million people in a country of 140 million. Right, so this silent majority is indeed quite powerful, and it's reproduced by the socioeconomic conditions and by the new structure of the Russian economy, which has, for all intents and purposes, has been renationalized. Right, we're living in a sort of a state capitalism, but it's controlled by a single center. So yeah, I would say that taken together, the sense of defeat, which has been institutionalized by the Putin propaganda on the one hand, and on the other hand, the objective socioeconomic conditions of new Russian capitalism have created this sort of social apathy and the structural inability to protest.
And Sam, you've got your hand raised there. Do you want to jump in?
I did want to just come in briefly on this. I agree with almost everything that Sergei said, but I wanted to clarify one thing, which is this idea of dependence, because I think dependence is in the eye of the beholder, right? So we as analysts, right, can look at where people are working and what the value chains are and the ways that they stretch back to the budget or state-owned corporations or the things that the government is doing. And we can trace the dependence that way, right? But for the vast majority of people, I think, who actually do earn their incomes that way in ways that are dependent directly or indirectly on the state, they don't tend to see it that way, right? They tend to see themselves as maybe more autonomous than they are, right? And they tend to see the state in a lot of ways is actually a problem. If you look at polls by Levada and studies by Levada, most people in Russia understand that the state is governed, not in their interests, not in the interests of the common man, not in the interests of ordinary citizens, but in the interests of oligarchs and other powerful people. So there's very little illusion about this, right? And the idea then is, if I'm taking something from the state, well, it's only because the state is actually taking things from me, right? Whereas it's a very different kind of equation than sort of what we think of traditionally as clientelism, right? In other parts of the world, right? So there were plenty of people, for example, under Chavez in Venezuela, right, who didn't like Chavez. And they would come out and protest. But Chavez could always rely on constituencies, right, that had been really fed and taken care of by the Venezuelan state, right, who felt that the Venezuelan state had their back, right, and they would come out as constituencies, as Chavistas, to support his regime. We saw that in parts of the Middle East as well. We see that in parts of Southeast Asia, where we have these sorts of clientelist systems. Russia is not that, right? Under Putin, there are no Putinistas, right? Who will come out to defend him, and when he needs them, he has to manufacture, or his people have to manufacture, right? Rallies full of people who are being bussed in by their employers, right? For a couple hundred rubles and half a day off in Moscow. So it's a very different kind of dependency. It's not I think it does not create a sense of loyalty in the way that we see in some other authoritarian regimes.
I'd like now, just for the last few minutes, before we move to audience questions, just a reminder, if anyone in the audience has got a question, we'll go to that in a few minutes. But I just wanted to ask Bill about Navalny and his treatment in the penal colony where he's currently being held. So what parallels and what differences do you see between the present Navalny case and that of Sergei Magnitsky back in 2008? And as a sort of follow-up to that, do you think the regime would be prepared to risk letting Navalny die in custody?
Well, I think that so the parallels are that Alexei Navalny is a truth teller and an exposer of corruption. Sergei Magnitsky was a truth teller and an exposer of corruption. That the regime doesn't like truth tellers and exposers of corruption, and so both men were arrested. Both men badly mistreated in prison. But the main difference between Magnitsky and Navalny is that the whole world now knows about Magnitsky, but they didn't know about Magnitsky when he was dying in prison, and the whole world knows about Navalny. And I mean, it's really pretty remarkable, actually, if you think about it. I mean, he, we all knew about Navalny a year ago, but most regular people didn't. But I would say now, if you were to stop an average person walking down the street in Britain, maybe not an average person, but anybody who watches the news, certainly in my circle of non-Russian specialist friends, 90% of them know about Navalny and how's that poor guy doing and what's going on and so on and so forth. And the level of awareness has created a real protection for him, which is that, Putin would pay a very, very dear price if he was killed. And I think that's why the situation resolved itself. I think when Biden's national security advisor said that if Alexei Navalny dies, there'll be serious consequences. That's not something that Putin can take lightly, and I think that that was pretty much mirrored around the world. Everybody was watching and waiting and seeing, and so it's. I mean, in a certain way, I kind of think that Putin is as much of a hostage in this situation as Navalny is, and Putin can't back down. He can't do anything other than keep the pressure on Navalny, but he can't put the pressure on too much, because if he does, then he faces an explosion inside of Russia and a very, very serious consequences outside of Russia. And there's a lot of people that sort of doubt whether people will come out to do crazy things inside of Russia if Navalny is killed. But I don't know if anyone, I don't know if Putin can feel confident about that, and I certainly don't think that's the case. So it really is a kind of clash of two very different people, but one where I mean, they're kind of equally powerful in a certain way, and I don't think anyone should underestimate that. And Alexei Navalny might not be in the news this week, but I've seen how these things play themselves out, and there's cycles of these moments, and he doesn't necessarily need a grassroots organization in order to achieve his objectives. All he needs to do is be this great symbol of defiance, which he's done remarkably.
And just on the topic of Navalny, we mentioned before how clearly he's this powerful symbol, but on the other hand, his actual approval ratings amongst Russians on the polls don't seem to be that great. Gulnaz, could you just tell us a bit about perhaps why you think that is, and also, do you think he has the potential to become a genuinely popular opposition leader?
So if I remember correctly from the recent study by several political scientists who tried to look into Navalny's popularity, the numbers that they've reached was that 20% of Russians approve or somehow support Navalny. And the discussion by the authors of this study, of course, brought the idea that the support is very low, that it's uncomparable with, say, today's approval level for Putin is 65%. So on the other hand, as Bill noted, there has been such a degree of transformation and dynamism with regard to just recognition of Navalny and also growing support that we need to recognize that dynamism as well. So 20% is much higher than the recognition levels or support levels that were, I think, 2 to 3% just a year ago. So, if it moved that quick over the 6 months, it could move, quickly over the next 6 months as well. However,
can I interrupt for just 1 second? Putin had a 2% approval rating when he became prime minister. Just sorry.
Yeah. So we need to recognize the dynamism and certain degree of unpredictability. Nonetheless, I think what Sergei was mentioning and that what I was telling and also Sam was talking about the Russian society, and it's this the apathy and sometimes quite an aggressive opposition to protests linked to support for Navalny or getting medical help for Navalny, sort of tell us that probably that quote unquote gray mass of people who find themselves not in the situation of those who want change, I do not see them quickly turning to supporting Navalny. So I think that that percentage cannot move all of a sudden from 20 to 80 or even to 65. It can probably move to, I don't know, 30, 35, but I'm just conjecturing. Now, just very recent Levada poll about the April 21st protests, pro-Navalny protests, suggested that 39% of Russians were negative and 42% were neutral about these protests, so just asking about the protests. And so that gives you what is the percentage that was excited and positive about it, which is pretty low. So we have that. Now, so therefore, I wouldn't be, at least, it didn't resonate with me when Bill was talking about, how Navalny probably thought that he could become president and that situation could change that quickly. I think they are more realistic and they understand both the unpredictability, but also just the cementation of the regime and of the system that is there in place. And also recognize that the degree of popularity of Navalny is probably has its limits. So I wouldn't be as optimistic as Bill sounded with regard to the potential for Navalny to become president. Now, I also, though, as I was just thinking today about Putin's strategy, thinking about constitutional amendments and their reason and whether Putin wants to stay until 2030 space for some sort of managed transition decision scenario of the type that occurred in Kazakhstan, and the constitutional amendment being there for the purpose of avoiding the inter-elite uncertainty and struggle as to who will be coming after Putin. So just, I think it's probably important for the Kremlin to have choice, but also to have space for managing it themselves from top, as opposed to facing the situation when the elites might be defecting because they don't believe in who is coming to power. This idea of patronal presidentialism that was developed by Henry Hale a while ago. But I think the Kremlin wanted to avoid that. And that is one of the reasons why these the end of the term and the possibility for Putin to run again has been brought up. So I do not exclude the situation for some sort of managed transition when someone picked by the Kremlin, someone we probably don't know even, might be there, rather than rather than we wait until 2036. I think the Kremlin want to have the possibility for that maneuver. I do not say that this is a very likely outcome, but I'm sure they do want to have that choice, because they also do realize that Putin is not eternal, and that type of transition will have to be thought through earlier or later. It could be 10 years in a row or earlier, and so that transition is being strategized, I would think.
Thank you very much. So we'll just move quickly to questions from the audience. We've had one in the chat from Peter, who asks, my question to the panelists is, how concerned do we need to be in the West about Russia? Unlike the old Soviet Union, Russia today does not seem bent on a global Cold War, but mainly on maintaining Putin and co in power. What would be the correct response to this from the Western powers? So maybe Sam, if we could hear briefly from you.
Well, it's a good question. I think, Peter, I think you're right, that we're not talking about the kind of sort of struggle for how the world is going to be governed, right? On the other hand, Russia is engaged in a struggle to at least carve out space for it to continue to be governed the way it is. And it feels that having its neighborhood governed the way it is important, right? So anything that would begin to change the way that countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Georgia are governed, right? The Russian government sees as threatening. It hems Russia in. It makes it difficult to continue to organize power the way it does, right? And we have seen Russia, right, draw and defend militarily lines on the map of Europe as a result of this, right? Both in Georgia and in Ukraine, and sending signals in other places as well. And so from that perspective, I mean, I think we need to not forget, right, that at least as long as we include Europe in the West, right, we are engaged in a military confrontation with Russia at the moment in Ukraine, and that is not a one-off thing. That is part of a bigger conflict over how the space between the European Union, and increasingly even in parts of the European Union itself, and Russia, right, are going to be governed. And that is a geopolitical and a geoeconomic confrontation that Europe is going to have to deal with, whether it wants to or not.
Sergei, you've got your hand up. You could just jump in briefly. We've only got a couple minutes left.
Yes, I just can add briefly to the question of Peter. I think it could be asked of the relatives of the 298 passengers and crew of the MH17 flight, which was downed over Donbass in 2014, or simply of the residents of Salisbury that were subject to Russian chemical warfare on the territory of Great Britain. It is true that Russia's global influence has dwindled, but it's much like the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. It was an ailing giant. It didn't have the ability to constructively shape international relations, but it had a lot of ability to disrupt international relations, to damage. And current Russia, Putin's Russia, has a lot of capacity to damage, especially developing new sorts of nuclear weapons and using its energy diplomacy, using methods of hybrid warfare, interfering in election campaigns, working with political parties, working with opposition and extremist groups, if this is a forum on extremism everywhere, and so on. So, Russia should not be underestimated for simply practical reasons, that there is a lot of disruptive potential in any possible domain of global life. So this is something to be kept in mind. So this is after Ukraine, I have to say, after 2014, this is the strange brew boiling, which could not be kept inside the pot. It has spilled over. It started threatening the neighboring states. It started threatening European and eventually global stability. So like containment and appeasement, if we take the metaphor from the 1930s, doesn't work any longer. It is already a global problem and it has to be tackled.
Thanks very much. We will actually have to leave it there, unfortunately, as we are out of time. But I'd just like to say a huge thank you to each of our panelists for giving up their time for our discussion today. It's been a pleasure to host you. I hope the audience has been able to learn something about some very topical issues in the world of international politics. The OFQE will be back this coming Monday with an event on terrorism in West Africa. But for now, that's everything. So thanks once again to our panelists and good night.